Okay, I think we're gonna slowly get started. We have this oddly big microphones for this big space because, of course, we're streaming this for perhaps primarily Martin's parents in Australia. It's possible. But hey, everyone! It's so great that you've all come. Hello, people at home. Helen. Hi. My name is Miriam. My name is Miriam. I'm the director of UKS, and I'm here with Martin White, who's an artist and who is behind this mammoth endeavor, and also, the current solo exhibition here at UKS called entitled Big Science Volume 1. And I'll hold on to this just for now, I think.
Yeah, sure.
But for you, dear audience, there are copies here that you're welcome to leaf through while we have this talk. And Martin and I are going to have a little conversation. And I think you're welcome to ask questions at any time, right?
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
So you can always ask questions. There is a microphone, and we can pass that around. And the microphone is really just for the audience at home to be able to hear your questions. You don't have to ask questions. There'll also be time at the end for a discussion. So we'll get started.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for being here, Martin.
No problem. Thank
It's
you.
been wonderful having you here at UKS, and maybe you want to just start by introducing this project.
Yeah. So, as briefly as possible, in 2016, I sought and received access to quite an extraordinary archive of medical images that had been donated to the Teknisk Museum. And the archive was of a Norwegian psychiatrist called Carl Wilhelm Sem-Jacobsen. And he had been experimenting on patients of Gaustad Psychiatric Hospital here in Oslo from 1956 until 1977. He got a little bit of funding from the Norwegian state, but the vast majority of his funding for this experimentation came from various agents in the US, including the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, various departments of the US military, including NASA and the Air Force and the Navy. He also worked with deep sea diving as the oil pipeline was being laid on the West Coast. And he worked quite a lot with aviation, from what I can tell. So this archive of images is vast and is not, they're medical images, but it's not a medical archive. It was his own kind of professional archive that was donated, that he donated to the museum. So it sits in this strange legal loophole whereby it's not really searchable. There's none of the images or the material has really been digitized, understandably, because it's so sensitive. And it is accessible, like I was able to access it. So it is publicly accessible, but to understand it is next to impossible. So I've spent 7 years trying to understand it. So I've also contributed, added a lot of information from archival searches in the US. So I went through the archives of the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, hundreds and hundreds of pages of grant reports and budgets and things like that to try to understand what was happening. So this work.
So you've actually not only looked through the archive, you've also altered the archive.
Yeah, I've added to it significantly, but in just here in this book, or just in the information that I have.
And what exactly is this book? I think you have to explain how you've worked with the archive. And maybe one thing Martin and I discussed before, when we were preparing for this talk, was to actually just ask you, audience, if you've all to just understand, like, how well do you actually know the work? How should we speak about this in a way that's most interesting to you? Please don't be ashamed if you haven't. engage with the work, that's absolutely fine. But have you all seen the exhibition and looked through this book? Most people are nodding. Okay, so it's probably quite a knowledgeable audience we have with us. And of course, we don't know who's watching at home, so this may be different for you. But maybe just tell the people who don't know this so well exactly what it is that you've done with the archive.
Well, to begin, the first kind of iteration actually was a performance lecture that I'll be doing here at the Finissage on the 6th. So that was kind of the first way of processing the material really and talking people through it. And then a few years ago in 2021, I think, I just started reproducing it, drawing it. And it was a little bit of like as a way of reproducing the images, but also because within Sem-Jacobsen's archive is a photograph of a comic book panel in which he is cited in an editor's note. And so that kind of triggered this idea that maybe this is an interesting project to draw, to kind of make a comic book out of, because then materially it's kind of similar to my experience, of leafing through this material and holding it and being able to kind of pore over images or circle around them. And so that kind of suggested the form. And that's also kind of convenient because then I could serialize it. It didn't have to be a singular definitive work. This is a work that I've released in 4 parts. So it's, I don't have to know where it's going. I don't entirely know where it's going. I know where it might go. You can leave little threads for yourself. I think the formal parts of underground publishing or comic book publishing were sort of attractive to me in that sense, because it's a kind of way of almost improvising in public, which seemed a nice thing to do with this material,
And concretely, you trace items from the archive. And then you told me this, I didn't know, this is a classic comic book strategy. You draw something quite big and then you photocopy it, and that tightens it up.
You reduce it,
So when you say pour over, it's really hours and hours spent on each little item in the archive, and you're in your 7th year of this work. And I'm bringing that up just because I think one of the things that I love about this project, and that were one of the things that I think were also really appealing and puzzling because Martin's work was chosen through all of our exhibitions here in the solo exhibition program at UKS are chosen through an open call. And your portfolio is specific in the way that it's not very long. It's few very tight projects. And then, of course, a lot of it is this work, because it's what's taken up your time for a long time. And when you sit with something like this and you know that you have to fill an exhibition space, there's a kind of really interesting paradox, because this both grows out of a kind of art context, but is also kind of a little bit ridiculous to put back into an art context. So, and how do you actually, what do you do with something like this? So that's been, I don't know where this question is leading, other than that's just a kind of interesting, I think an interesting question to work with. What does it mean to put an object like this back into an exhibition setting? And we're not going to talk so much about the exhibition today. I think you should all go see it and spend time in it if you have time after we've talked, or come back another day. We're going to talk more about this book. And what we thought would be fun, perhaps, was that to do a little, almost a little slide projection without slides. So Martin's brought some things from the archive that we're going to depart from and use them to kind of unfold this work in a way that's a little bit different than it is in this book itself, because this book of course, is narrated. It has your voice, and your voice is very strong in the book. But it's a narration, of course, that has a specific rhythm and a specific kind of a build. And we wanted to try to look at the different fragments in this work slightly differently. And it was also a way of kind of trying to tease out some of the themes that live in this book, which a lot of them have to do with consent and ethics. So I think I imagine we're going to be talking about that quite a lot. And then I don't know how much we're going to talk about this, but we'll see, Martin. One of the things that Martin said to me in one of our meetings was, I just don't know what's the work really about. So that's kind of an implicit aim of this conversation today, to try to find out what the work is really about. But you told me today that you don't mind so much anymore. But I guess but I think it's an interesting question to it's also just an interesting question whether we're even able to answer a question like that. What is the work really about? It's in a way too simple and too vast at the same time. But I think maybe we'll get started. Do you want to take up the first?
Yeah, so I selected...
maybe you should, when you show it, we can pass it around, but maybe you'd want to also just briefly describe what it is you're showing when you...
Yeah, of course.
When you do.
I will pass these around, but I'll just kind of hold it up. Oh yeah, thanks. That's wonderful. So these are images that I sort of haven't used before from the archive. So this is one of the... this is kind of typical of the imagery that I was looking at. It's a visual description of the surgical procedure. So it's labeled final preparation. So all of the notation in his archive is in English. It's a patient's head that's been fixed into what's called a stereotactic frame. So that frame in neurosurgery is used to precisely locate the X, Y, and Z axes in the brain in three-dimensional space, so that when you're drilling into somebody's skull, you can kind of precisely measure where you are. So it's kind of important to note that this was actually cutting edge at the time, and that it was conducted by a neurosurgeon. But they're powerful images. It looks really, they're powerful.
And perhaps something because already we're kind of walking into ethical considerations, right?
Yeah.
So we have images here of that are quite explicit. They're not, they're not pleasant to look at.
Yeah.
We know with some certainty that that both these operations and the images have been performed, or the operations have been performed and the images have been made without the patient's consent?
Yeah, so that was a key piece of information that was actually a piece of original research. So that's Sem-Jacobsen. There's a whole chapter on ethics in his book. And there was a Norwegian government inquiry that published its findings in 2002. And their conclusion was that he was operating within the realm of what was ethically acceptable at the time. However, in some of my archival searches with a foundation in the States that funded him, I received a board meeting report. So this is much like I guess UKS do with an open call. This was a group of professionals assessing all of the applications. And it was the notes from that meeting. So that this was contemporaneous. It was in 1960. And in there, they say that he told them that he didn't require consent and he didn't ask for it. And they also said that the therapeutic value of his work was negligible, and that it was purely experimental. He wasn't. At least he told them that he didn't need to and did not ask for consent to either photograph or collect the data or to operate.
But then, as an artist or as an interpreter or someone working with this material, what are the kind of ethical considerations you've had?
Oh God, a multiplex and so many of them. I don't know, with images like this or material like this, there's such a temptation to aestheticize it, or there is an aesthetic. There's really clearly an aesthetic. So I'm constantly working against that, and I'm also trying to view it.
Wait, can you explain what you mean by that?
The aesthetic, or I mean, they're good photographs. It's a really difficult thing to This is a image of a pilot that's had. These are just surface electrodes, so they're on the surface of his scalp. So it's technically it's just a compelling photograph, right? So there's a kind of, I don't know, there is an aesthetic sensibility to it that I find kind of compelling. And there's also, I mean, there's as a layperson, as a non-scientist, a non-neurologist or neurosurgeon or psychiatrist, they look alarming, yeah? So I'm constantly trying to backpedal from my own visceral reaction to these things, or to try to understand it in context. I think I write somewhere in the book, everything is context, and context is everything. So this comes from somewhere and is going somewhere. So I'm trying to understand all the time what it is that's happening. And it's difficult because I'm reproducing images of exploitation. There's just no way around it. That's what these are. And in making this work, I'm reproducing those images. So I'm trying to contextualize that all the time and to sort of slow it down, or to unpack that constantly, and to make the audience aware of that.
And some places, of course, in the book, you've the kind of strategy to get around these questions for you has been this. So to reinterpret the image, to kind of take it away from its photographic form, and then use these post-it notes to mask some of the perhaps most difficult content.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've also reproduced in the book the original contracts that I had to sign to access the images with the Technical Museum, and so they were really broad contracts that said that I wasn't to copy or reproduce or distribute or reveal the identity of anybody in the images, actually nor even discuss the existence of the contract. And that sort of speaks to it speaks to the sensitivity surrounding the images. But very early on, when I was working on this, I saw a couple of lawyers and conducted legal risk assessments to assess the kind of liability that doing work like this had, and also I now have a completely different agreement with the Technical Museum. But the reason to include the contract is to draw attention to my choices of reproducing something that really shouldn't exist in the first place, I suppose. It's a way of kind of,
Maybe you want to show the next slide, or the next two, which to me at least feel like they belong together a little bit.
Yeah. So these are this is material that I'm only just starting to work with now in the studio. It's quite an amazing, like, it's an electronic circuit diagram, but it's a circuit diagram of the procedure. So at the center of it is a human subject, and they're surrounded by the various, the various kinds of electronic stimulation and the cameras and oxygen and various operators. Then next is, I don't know, this is difficult to contextualize because Sem-Jacobsen's work with the Air Force is still quite unknown to me. It appears to be photographs of a pilot. It's labeled observations during bomb run. And so it appears to be of a pilot going into and coming out of unconsciousness, probably at high altitude. The altitude's measured in the little graph at the bottom and the speed. So that's a thing that happens with pilots flying at high altitude, is that their consciousness can lapse. And so Sem-Jacobsen had developed a piece of commercial machinery that could monitor whether a pilot was still conscious. Because at the time there were kind of aircraft that were being made that could fly at much higher altitudes than was thought possible previously. Yeah.
I find it super interesting to see these, this is early neuropsychology, right?
Yeah.
So neuropsychology is obviously neuropsychology is all about kind of, it's not about it's not psychoanalysis. But there seems also to be something quite of the time. I'm testing out a thesis now. There's something very of the time in this like almost cybernetic this cybernetic model of a human, or a human within a kind of machinic context, or a human drawn up as a machine, a piece of machinery. And this is, it's 1960, did you say?
I'm not sure of the dates of this. The archive, between 56 and 77 is broadly what I can say, but I don't specifically know for each image.
So it's not super long after World War II.
No.
It's in the time of like early computing.
Yeah.
It's at a time where the space race is in full swing. And did you say that he was also working with NASA?
Yeah.
So there's all of these, and we know, of course, from like histories of technology that a lot of technological progress happens in relation to war. Yeah. So the computer, for example, came out of the Second World War as a coding device, of course, and to the extent, and the space race was thoroughly enmeshed with the Cold War, of course. So there's I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, except that this is perhaps this kind of large-scale institutional history, international institutional history, really comes out in these images. And maybe that's not something that's so present in the kind of earlier chapters of the book. Is that something then you're looking more into now?
Yeah, I think.
And what are you finding out?
Yeah, well, broadly, I mean, the kind of the something that really interests me, and I want to try to maintain objectivity, but something that really interests me is the kind of the association between psychiatry as an institution and industry and government, and I find that is a very early 20th century kind of story. And then the ways that was kind of used and unfolded throughout the 20th century, and then the things that we're left with now. I mean, this, what he was doing, it was rudimentary, compared to today, but it was not a million miles away from what Neuralink say that they're doing now.
Maybe explain what Neuralink is to those who might not know.
It's Elon Musk's company to implant small brain chips. He said, I don't know, it's a tech company, so they do kind of these Apple-like demonstrations that then neuroscientists around the world have kind of discredited. But so Elon Musk says that they hope to be able to create, it's a brain-machine interface. They want to be able to remotely regulate mood or help people with mood disorders or depression. Nobody thinks that's possible. What might be possible is that people with mobility issues can use the brain interface to remotely control phones or computers. But the thing that is actually probably going to happen, because it's a tech company, is that it becomes a device to gather data of its users. So that's like convenience means that there's going to be a lot of users, and then the kind of data is incredibly valuable at the moment. So so it's still a kind of thing, this whole idea of the kind of the brain-machine interface as a way of controlling emotion is still seems to be a desire.
I'm wondering if there are any questions in the audience. Yeah? Marius, can you pass the microphone?
Thank you. I don't know if it's a well-formulated question yet, but I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about the Technical Museum, maybe because I'm its neighbor. But this thing of like gathering that material, and also sort of the kind of relationship you had with the Technical Museum, and I was curious about that, the negotiation you had to do with the way you're kind of interacting with the materials, also the process of drawing, which is There are so many processes, and I was thinking about it here. It's being shown here in art context, but I'm wondering, like, you're kind of a library now. You're like, you're an archive in itself, and like, are you in thinking about where it's going now, where it will be shown, or what kind of conversations are coming out of this? Also, because you're still trying to figure out, or at least that's what you're saying. What does it mean? What is it about? Will the project meet other kind of fagmiljøer or like communities or audiences or current psychiatrists and scientists? I'm very curious about that. Like, will it go back to the Technical Museum? What was the first question? What is the renegotiation of the contract? Second question: are you thinking about it using the Technical Museum? Because now the tech as a venue or as a something in relationship with the Technical Museum, because now the Technical Museum is also somehow kind of it's a playground for kids and dads, which are very eager to press buttons. So I'm thinking about like all these ethical, political, social, historic questions. Can they be fed back into the museum somehow, or And I was just curious about your relationship to the Technical Museum. Also, I know the conservator who worked at the Kunstnernes Hus, who's now hired for medical history at the Technical Museum. So I'm like, I will also kind of,
Oh, that's great.
I will introduce you.
I mean, the story of like that kind of archival work is long, but I think it's super important for artists to do that work because we've got time. I mean, like it's and we're persistent, and so I was going there. It was like in the second year of my master's, so I was just going all the time and scanning and just for my records. The first hour of the first day, I think I was accompanied by the archivist the entire time. But really quickly that became a kind of issue. They couldn't afford to keep doing that because I was there all the time. So, it was a good relationship. It was a really, really good relationship. So when I first developed the lecture performance, two representatives of the photo archive came to my studio to see it and to kind of approve it, which I was happy to do. I understood the nature of the material. And so they did. And then when I was performing that work, somebody from the medical museum, which sort of sits in the technical museum, came to see it, and she became a great champion of the work, and she facilitated the renegotiation of the contract entirely. I don't know what that process was like internally, but it's a very open agreement that I have now, and so, but also throughout, whenever the Technical Museum's photo archive got approached about this material, they'd be referred to me. People that were would just end up kind of on the phone with me, or like writing to this Australian guy. Like, so I was getting these emails from like aviation experts in the north of Norway, or conspiracy theorists, or like it was really very interesting. There's been quite a lot of people that I've corresponded with. So I have kind of become the sort of expert, and also it's like I'm the one that has digitized the material too. I've scanned it and made like spreadsheets of it. Yeah. Can I out you, Phil? Phil is Phil can introduce himself.
I'm Phil Loring. I'm one of the curators at the National Medical Museum, one of the two. So I look forward to meeting your friend, Thea. I don't know her at all, and I'm really excited about. I wish I could say I was involved, but very much looking forward to seeing her. And we do have a long relationship with Martin, and a good, positive one, I think. And what's also interesting, though, and what you may not know, or may know, is that we get complaints as well as interest. And so we do have to, sometimes we don't necessarily feel like it's worth spending your time on it, but we get people who say, there's this artist who's running around Oslo, and he is talking about Sem-Jacobsen as if his work was exploitative only. And yet he has a legacy, in which case, in some cases, which is a positive legacy, and we feel like that part of his story is being denied. And so, yeah, we find ourselves having to deal with these kind of questions. And I mean, we do have a part of the current medical exhibition which shows some of these pictures, and also shows Sem-Jacobsen's EEG machines. So we have some of his stuff on display, and that's very largely thanks to you that we know how to interpret some of that. And the way that we've interpreted it is we've said that he is a very controversial figure and also a pioneer. And that alone, that statement has been argued that we should not be saying that. We shouldn't be saying that he's controversial. And we've pushed back very strongly and said, in fact, we do think that he is controversial. And it's not because we are necessarily, we're not siding with the artist, so to speak, on this. We have our own historical reasons why we consider this to be a legitimate statement about who Sem-Jacobsen was. So it gets complicated what our relationship is to this work, but we're fascinated by it, and we definitely do have an interest in future relationships in that way. So
this is super interesting, I think, because as I think we're so well trained in contemporary art to be super critical on specific parameters often, and Musk, for example, obviously a controversial figure who obviously is also doing a lot of, well, I'm sure not everyone would agree with me, but lots more people are driving electric cars. Don't know that I can say anything about Twitter, but he's also driving a lot of change. And I think there's definitely a tendency in our field to kind of problematize and complicate things and maybe not look so much at the kind of positive change that something controversial may have also incurred. So I'm actually quite, maybe could you say a little bit about the ways in which he has done pioneering? You know, because we've talked a lot about the problems of the ethical concerns in this work.
Well, just a very quick response is that what emerged from the lobotomies was a new approach to brain stimulation that means stimulating deep inside the brain specifically for Parkinson's. And that's usually the story in a narrow sense, which is given as the justification for how he did what he did. It's a complicated story, and that's only a tiny part of it. But that's usually the story that's given by his students, the people who worked with him, the people who knew him best ultimately. So there's something to be said for that.
And I think it's also super important now or I'd like to maybe make a little kind of methodological distinction, because I think this is important when you think about kind of methods of material culture or museological methods in material culture and in contemporary art. Those are kind of two quite different fields in the way that I think in contemporary art there's what we do is really abstract knowledge, and I think, I mean, I may be wrong, so you can correct me, Phil, if I'm wrong. But you know, an object shown in a medical museum or an object shown in a kind of a cultural history museum is there as a representative of itself. The phone is there to represent a phone. But in a contemporary art setting, the phone isn't there as a phone, it's there as a symbol of something or as a comment on something. It has a kind of meta dimension, and those are two very, very different ways of objects functioning. And I think this is super important to say just in terms of this critique, I think, because it's so interesting. It's really about how do you read a certain story or a certain material within different contexts. Because, you know, I think in most ways this isn't a work about Sem-Jacobsen. It's a work about, you know, it's a work that uses Sem-Jacobsen to history and archive to ask a series of interconnected, difficult questions. And maybe we can bring out the girls now.
Yeah, I think Nora had a question or a comment. We moved away. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It was a question about methodology. Maybe
Oh yeah.
Seems pretty relevant. We can get back to the girls afterwards.
I'm always into the girls in medical history. So I've had the privilege of speaking with you about your methodology several times. I have a lot of admiration for your method. I'm not delusional. I don't think anybody makes an artwork from a neutral place ever. But I have been curious and sometimes envious of the way that you work and how you access archives. And I'm just curious because in your conversation, you're speaking as if you think there could be a neutral way to handle historical data. Don't be foolish, Martin. I know you're smart.
No, I don't think there is a neutral way of doing it, but I think that there are academic and journalistic ways that privilege objectivity, right? Like
You mean in writing?
Yeah. Yeah, but even just in kind of analysis. But I think it's a smokescreen. Everything, of course, is incredibly subjective. So any kind of interpretation of data or selection of data or even the parameters that catch the data is biased from the outset. We know that. So So that's why I think art's a really interesting tool to use to analyze this kind of material, because it can wear the subjectivity on its sleeve. And so I like to strive for an impossible neutrality, because I know that it's absolutely impossible. But I think that
So that's a style choice for you.
Yeah, and an ethical one, I think, too, because the material is, as Phil said, like Sem-Jacobsen, like his family exists. He has a legacy. Like any of this stuff can come back to bite me or be problematic for anybody, you know, that was associated, or a family of a patient that was experimented upon, you know. Like, so I'm careful of my sources, and I'm always pointing towards where I got the material. I'm not in the work. I'm a very opinionated person, but in the work itself, my opinion is actually not there very much. I'm choosing what to...
Not explicitly, at least.
No, not explicitly, but I'm choosing what to show and when to show it. And there's a lot that you can do with that. And I guess that's what I'm sort of playing when I play it, yeah.
Your intense attention to Sem-Jacobsen over so many years says a lot, I would say.
Like, this is one of the questions I have written down. What brings you? What is it that keeps bringing you back to this? And I think in a way, like the answer of "it's so interesting, it's such an interesting archive" is too easy.
But
I mean, it's 7 years of work. You could also have been super interested in something for 3 years. That would also have been quite a good amount of time. So what is it that, you know, can you say anything about what it is that keeps bringing you back to this?
I don't know. I don't think that... I mean, it wasn't a solid 7 years, so I did take a break. But at a certain point, it just occurred to me that material, you just don't come across material like this very often, maybe ever in a career.
Also because it's eccentric, right? Like,
yeah,
we haven't talked about much about the comic book, but we talked about it a little bit in the beginning. But of course, the reason you made this graphic novel format was because there was a comic book in the archive, and it's the Psycho Pirates comic book, which, you know, in a medical archive is an interesting thing to find. Yeah,
totally. I mean, everything. There's images. I've got images of like lunar lander tests that are in Sem-Jacobsen's archive. It's just so strange. It's like the lunar lander. So this is like tests of the... I mean, that's just sitting there in his archive. It's like, why?
It's also formatted like a scrapbook.
Yeah, exactly. So like in terms of kind of cultural analysis, this is like... And this is what I say in the exhibition too. This is comics, right? This is reading image and image, text, image. There's something that occurs in the gap between the images. Formally, it's almost identical to reading comics, reading an archive and analysing an archive, and so it becomes this really interesting task to do. So yeah, I think the wealth of material, the amount of it, the breadth of it, what it covers, like things like. Like I said, the Navy and the oil industry, the Cold War, the space program, the history of psychiatry, the history of medicine, even the end of the Second World War in Norway, like all of these things, the complicity between Norway, or the association between Norway and the States during the Cold War, the Marshall Plan. There's so much to talk about through this work.
Let's talk about the girls before we end, because we're slowly running out of time.
Yeah.
So this is something. So what I asked Martin to bring today were things that you wouldn't find just from reading the book and spending time in the exhibition. So things that point towards what you might be working on in the future, and also like little secret behind the scenes nuggets. And this is, I remember it quite distinctly when you showed me this in your studio. There's a series of images. Well, I'll let you explain.
Yeah, so because of Sem-Jacobsen's work with the aviation industry, the Air Force in the US, and also this program called Sea Lab that was run by the US Navy. He was conducting these business trips to the States a lot. And so there's this box of slides in the archive that I began scanning, and they show these business trips, and they just stand in kind of stark counterpoint to, to the quality of the. So Sem-Jacobsen's in the center of this image there. There's a little hand-drawn sign that says the EEG Research Institute, Gaustad, Oslo, and he's he's got these 3 assistants with him, and a guy that's wearing this device that was the device I spoke of before, that was able to kind of monitor heart rate and brain activity. And I think he was a diver, the guy that's wearing it. And so there's hundreds of these slides, and they end up kind of morphing into strange, almost family holiday snaps. Like they've got this, like they're.
Should I show some of them?
Yeah,
yeah. I'll be the slide projector.
So I think they're applying the surface electrodes. So again, just gluing the electrodes to the scalp of the diver. I think that's what they're doing. Yeah. Yeah.
When did he die?
1991. Yeah. In these photos, these 3 assistants are often wearing complementary clothing. So you can see that they're all wearing the same kind of top and the same kind of capri pants. And like there's these... but it's noticeable. Like you see it, they're all... Yeah, they're coordinated. Yeah, but yeah, then you start to get these images that are really just kind of holiday snaps. I don't know who these assistants are. I know their names just through looking at labels on the slides and so on, but I've not been able to locate any of them.
Were these in the same archive?
Yeah. Yeah, they're not like they're not physically printed. They just exist in boxes in as slides. Yeah.
And why are they interesting? I'm thinking, actually, I find them maybe more, when you showed them to me the first time, I think I was a little provoked. And I think maybe I was provoked from a kind of Me Too perspective, #MeToo. Like, here's this older, here's this older man clearly in a position of power, and then there are these young assistants in this setting. I mean, they look like they're having fun, but it's a little odd. And you can kind of, the imagination quickly runs to like the kind of, Yeah, but again, difficult aspect. But then on the other selection. Yeah, you made the selection, and also,
and that tells that story.
Let's say that you made an archive of your life. Surely it would also be a mix of, your personal archive would also be a mix of like
open shirts and cowboy hats.
Open shirts and cowboy hats in Australia. Pictures of you and your friends. Pictures from art exhibitions. Little, mementos. How are you thinking about these images now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that they're a counterpoint. Like they stand in really interesting counterpoint to the images of the patients. I think that they're photographs of a different, perhaps a different kind of power imbalance, and a different kind of sort of bodily exploitation that can happen just through labor, like through working, that you end up being documented as a part of your job quite often when you work anywhere. But I think it was mostly actually the counterpoint to the medical images that attracted me in the first place. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said that any kind of historical analysis is applying the ethics of now to, applying them in hindsight. And so it's important to kind of not only do that. It's like that's an obvious thing to do, but it's important to do more than that. So I don't know. I'm interested in who these people are. What they seem to be working for him and with him for a long time. Yeah, I don't know. It just the quality of them again is becomes kind of interesting.
Because obviously this is also an archive that silences a lot of people, or like I would say subjects, but Sem-Jacobsen has a very distinct voice in the archive through his, as the person putting it together. And then there are all these humans who are just depicted and have very little agency. I think you could argue in a kind of archival context, these women didn't explicitly choose to be depicted and put in, or to be saved in this archive. All the patients who were being operated on didn't necessarily consent to it. The diver, he might have posed for a picture, but he didn't say yes to being in, being preserved for history. I don't know that there's a question there.
No, but this is an interesting thing. So this was like the archive was donated by Sem-Jacobsen. So this was his professional archive. This is the material that forms, and this is an interesting thing to think about, that this is the material that forms what he believed at that time. I believe it was donated in the early 80s, what formed his legacy. So this is the material that he, that should form the body of how he wanted to be known and recorded. So there's already a kind of selection process going on at that level, so you can kind of use that to interpret the breadth of somebody's ambition or their what it was they believed that they were doing, or what it was that he believed he was doing. So this forms a part of that. I mean, it's there in a public archive. It's searchable. And I assume that was the intention of donating it, is so that it could be researched and people could understand him and his work. So that's what I'm doing. And this is part of it. So this is part of how he chose to be seen. And that, I don't know, that's... I don't really know what to say about that.
I think actually that's not a bad place to end.
Yeah.
But and it would be nice maybe to take one or two questions if there are any in the audience before we end. Are there any questions? No questions. Then I just want to say thanks so much, Martin, for coming tonight.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you everyone for coming to this talk. It's you've been a great audience. We're open for another hour here at UKS, so there's time to go see the exhibition and look at Big Science. And it's also for sale, I should say, and there's more volumes coming. You can buy it either here at UKS, but you should also, if you're not already signed up to Martin's newsletter, you should do that and follow the work as it progresses. So thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.